Hi, this is Trevor Evans, and this is a presentation I gave at the 29th IFSCC Congress that was held in Orlando, Florida in November of 2016. And it's entitled A Unifying Theory for Visualizing the Causes of Hair Breakage and Subsequent Strategies for Mitigation. I think we can all agree that if we ask hair care consumers about their major problems and issues, that breakage is going to be pretty high on that list. When hair fibres break, the ends will fray and give rise to unsightly split ends, which in sufficient numbers can start to produce a frizzy appearance and hinder the ability to grow beautiful flowing hair. And so consumers look to product manufacturers for help in this area. But of course, in order to fix a problem, it's first necessary to understand the underlying causes. And in this presentation, I'd like to propose an alternative way about thinking about hair breakage. As you'll see, it's a theory, it's an idea that encompasses traditionally considered contributors, but as with any good theory, it also makes predictions by which they can be tested. And to this end, it makes predictions as to the contribution of sources that perhaps we've not necessarily previously considered. In addition, I also hope to convince you that these new factors, these new contributors, might very well outweigh those that we've traditionally considered. I'm also going to present this work in a somewhat reverse manner. In actuality, we generated a considerable amount of data which led us to these ideas, but in retrospect the theory is so simple and so instinctive that in this instance I'm going to begin with the theory and then go through a thought process exercise to look at some of the predictions that come out of this theory, and then I'm going to show data that backs up these ideas. So let's start by looking at the traditional way of thinking about hair breakage. We know hair is a remarkably strong material as a result of its amazingly complex composite structure, which is shown at the top left of this slide. We know it's very strong because we can measure its mechanical properties, and a traditional way of doing this involves tensile experiments whereby single hair fibers are stretched at a constant rate of extension while measuring the amount of force that builds up. These experiments produce the typical stress-strain curves that are shown in the bottom left of this slide. From these graphs, there's a number of parameters that can be extracted to provide structural information, but from a strength perspective, perhaps the most instinctive parameter is the break force, which is the amount of force necessary to cause the fiber to break, which you can see here at the end of the graph where the force drops down to 0. However, the break force can be somewhat of a misleading parameter, as it's strongly dependent on fiber dimensions, where, all things being equal, a thick fiber will clearly be stronger than a thin one. For this reason, in the mechanical testing world, we're more interested in what would be termed a break stress, where stress is simply the force normalized relative to the fiber dimensions. So prior to beginning any experiment, we would measure the fiber dimensions using a laser micrometer, and the results are then expressed in a force per unit area, which is stress. Hair is very variable substrate, so it's necessary to run a suitable number of replicate samples. But by this approach, it becomes possible to quantify the decreases in hair's tensile properties that result from various insults that we subject the hair to, such as chemical treatments, which we know deplete the number of strength-supporting cysteine disulfide bonds within the hair. So this is good. We can measure the hair's fundamental tensile strength. But with that said, when materials fail, they tend to fail at their weakest point. Any crack, any flaw, any blemish within a sample represents a point of weakness that can be propagated by the repeated action of an external stimulus. By means of example, when we hear news stories about bridges collapsing, it's not because the last truck that passed over the bridge exceeded the bridge's tensile strength. Instead, it's the cumulative effect of all of those trucks which propagate any flaws until a catastrophic failure ultimately occurs. So from a hair perspective, we obviously think about the repetitive action of combing, brushing, or other practices, and recognize that similar processes can probably occur. There's a well-established discipline that deals with the failure of materials under repetitive actions, and it's called fatigue testing. I think you can see by the previous argument, in the fatigue testing world, basically it becomes all about the flaws. It becomes all about the presence of flaws, and also all about the propagation rate of those flaws. And in essence, we propose that all factors that contribute to hair breakage can be compartmentalized into these two simple groupings. So what can contribute to the presence of flaws in fibers? Well, perhaps the most logical one involves the condition of the hair, the relative health versus the relative damage level of the hair. We talked about the effect of chemical treatments and how they can compromise the protein structure, and we can imagine similar effects from photochemical oxidation by the sun's rays, or perhaps the high temperatures utilized in hair styling. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget about the ability to create mechanically induced flaws, perhaps by putting hair in ponytails, in braids, by detangling snags during the grooming process. We can conceptualize how hair type can be a factor. African hair is recognized to be especially fragile and prone to breakage, and it's been suggested that the highly kinky conformation leads to points of high stress along the fibers where flaws would develop. We can also see how hair length would be a contributor, where longer hair has clearly received more wear and tear because of its advanced age, but also just statistically there's a higher likelihood of finding a flaw in a long fiber as opposed to a comparable shorter fiber. So let's now turn our attention to thinking about factors that can affect the propagation rate of flaws. Clearly you would expect a faster flaw propagation rate when applying larger fatiguing insults. For example, repetitive action of a higher force would propagate flaws faster than a low force, which again makes us think about the magnitude of our combing or our brushing forces. We said that from a mechanical testing perspective that it's stress that is important rather than force, and stress is force per unit area. So fiber dimensions will also become important. The repeated application of a given force on fibers of progressively lower dimensions will produce higher stresses and therefore a higher tendency for breakage. And if we apply a given force to a rigid material, then it's going to induce a given amount of deformation, but if we apply that same force to a softer material, then it's going to produce a much bigger deformation. And again, instinctively we would expect that the repeated application of a greater deformation or strain would be expected to propagate flaws faster than a smaller one, even though the applied force is still the same. So we hypothesized that the mechanical properties of materials will also be important to the breakage profile. So let's talk now about how to perform these experiments. A commercially available single fiber fatigue testing instrument is available and sold by the Diastron Corporation in the UK. Individual hair fibers are prepared by crimping between brass ferrules to produce the test specimens, which are loaded automatically into the instrument, where they're then subjected to a repeated application of a user-defined force until the fibers ultimately break. At that time the instrument automatically removes the fiber and moves on to the next one. The way I like to look at the data is to use what the fatigue industry calls an SN curve, where S stands for the magnitude of the repeating stress, and N is the number of cycles of that stress that's required to induce breakage. So for example, maybe the instrument is repeatedly applying a 50-gram load to the hair fiber. We've measured the dimensions of the hair beforehand, so we can convert our force into a force per unit area of stress. And when the fiber ultimately breaks, we then plot the magnitude of this stress against the numbers of cycles to fail, and gradually we build up a graph similar to the one shown on the right-hand side of this slide. So here I've blown up that same graph, and you can see that this is data that was collected for virgin Caucasian hair that was tested at 60% relative humidity. And if I were to perform the traditional stress strain experiment on this same hair type under the same conditions, we come to the conclusion that the dry state break stress was around 0.021 grams per square micron, which I think you can see is off the graph that we show here. And so based on this information, we might expect that if it takes 0.021 grams per square micron of stress to break a hair fiber, well, if this condition is never realized or never exceeded, then we might expect that the hair fiber would not break. But from this graph we can see that that's not true, and hair fibers do break, and in fact they'll break in a relatively predictable manner upon the repeated application of forces and stresses that are considerably below the so-called break stress or break force. And this graph suggests that I can repeatedly apply a stress that's less than half of the break stress, and we'll still induce fiber breakage after around 50,000 cycles. This graph also shows how the repeated application of a higher stress does indeed give rise to faster breakage than if we were applying a lower stress, as we said appeared instinctive. But perhaps what was not instinctive is we can see from the logarithmic y-axis on this plot that there's actually an exponential relationship between the magnitude of the repeating stress and the tendency for failure. In other words, if our grooming forces go up, our fatiguing forces go up, and we expect an exponentially higher tendency for hair breakage. So if I was to ask why does chemically treated hair give rise to higher levels of breakage, I think the answer that we most normally would get revolves around the argument earlier on where we said that we are depleting the number of strength supporting cysteine disulfide bonds. But here we're presented with an alternative explanation. Chemical treatments give rise to higher grooming forces result in higher fatiguing forces, and therefore we would get an exponentially higher tendency for breakage. However, conversely, an ability to lower the grooming forces will bring about an exponentially lesser tendency for breakage. And of course, this is exactly what conventional conditioner products do. These treatments lubricate the hair surface, reduce the combing forces, and consumers do indeed associate conditioners with an ability to strengthen hair. These products clearly don't change the tensile properties of hair per se, but it would seem that in consumer language, an ability to lessen hair breakage is interpreted as strengthening. So we've been talking about fatiguing and grooming forces, but as discussed earlier, it's really the grooming and fatiguing stresses that are important, and force is only one component of this term, the other of course being fibre dimensions. We don't know the actual fatiguing forces experienced by individual fibres during grooming, but by arbitrarily selecting some forces, we can vary the fibre dimensions, we can then calculate the resulting stresses, and then we can use the linear regression line of the SN curve to determine the average numbers of cycles to fail. And in doing so, we can model the effect of fibre dimensions on breakage. Of course, if there's an exponential relationship between a stress and the cycles to fail, then there must also be an exponential relationship between the fibre dimensions and the cycles to fail, which you can see in this graph here. And because we have an exponential relationship, it can be seen that under certain conditions, even very small changes can produce substantial effects. In a nutshell, unfortunately, those with fine hair, you can see just intrinsically, are going to have a higher tendency for hair breakage. This graph now shows two SN curves. In black we show the data points from before for virgin Caucasian hair, and in red we have data points that were obtained from a panelist's hair. This panelist had hair that was slightly longer than shoulder length, and they had not performed any chemical treatments on the hair. And when we prepared the test specimens, we crimped the very tips of the hair fibres, such that we believe we're testing hair that's probably received somewhere between 1 to 1.5 years worth of wear and tear. You can see that the new SN curve sits lower than the previous one, although the regression lines really are remarkably parallel, and we will see this trend over and over again as we look at future data sets. If we were to use the conventional stress-strain approach to look at these two hair types, we would come to the conclusion that the panelist's hair actually had a break stress of about 10% lower than the pristine virgin hair. But from our SN curve, remembering that we have a logarithmic y-axis, if we use the regression lines to obtain an average of the numbers of cycles to fail at any given condition, we actually find that the panelist's hair requires 70% fewer cycles to induce breakage. And this again is a reoccurring theme when we perform fatigue testing, in that we almost always obtain substantially bigger differences by the fatigue method than we see with the traditional stress-strain approach. And so it is entirely possible that because of our historical reliance on the stress-strain approach, that we've always been producing an underestimate as to the impact of various hair insults on the tendency for hair breakage. This next graph similarly shows SN curves for virgin Caucasian hair and African hair, both generated at 60% relative humidity. As we said before, African hair is recognized to be especially fragile, with breakage frequently being highlighted as the biggest problem for people with this hair type, so much so that it often leads to very different habits and practices. You can see that there's considerably more scatter in the African hair data, which is actually an important point, but is outside the scope of this present presentation. And so this will be addressed in future later presentations. But for now, we'll just mention that despite this additional scatter, we can see that there is still, the regression lines are virtually parallel again. And if we were to perform the conventional stress-strain testing on these two hair types, then we would come to the conclusion that the African hair has a break stress that's about 13% lower than the Caucasian hair. This of course is significant, but perhaps doesn't sound dramatic enough to lead to completely different habits and practices. Conversely, by the fatigue method, we can see that there's an approximate order of magnitude, about a 10-fold drop in the numbers of cycles to fail for the African hair relative to the Caucasian hair. And so now we really are looking at a change which is more in line with what we hear from the consumers about needing to undergo different habits and practices. This next graph shows SN curves for relaxed and virgin African hair. Relaxers are certainly one of the most aggressive hair treatments and considerably compromise the hair's mechanical properties. Yet a high number of women of African ethnicity will still employ such practices as it affords them access to a greater number of hairstyles. Again, the regression lines of the two SN curves are virtually parallel, and this time demonstrate a decrease in the numbers of cycles to fail of about 2 orders of magnitude as a result of the chemical treatment. This can be compared to an approximate 30% decrease in the break stress by the conventional approach. Here we show SN curves for virgin Caucasian hair as a function of the relative humidity of the environment. Water is well known as a plasticizer for hair, and its abundance is well recognised to depend on the relative humidity of the environment. Therefore, hair's mechanical properties do decline with increasing relative humidity. But the extent of this effect again becomes magnified in fatigue experiments, with hair exhibiting really a pronounced increase in the tendency for breakage at elevated humidity. Earlier it was hypothesized that faster flow propagation would occur in less rigid or more plasticized samples, as the application of a common force or stress would impart a greater deformation or strain. This graph is taken to be a dramatic realization of this hypothesis. To put this into perspective, this table shows the average numbers of cycles to fail, as we obtain from the SN regression lines, when hair fibers are repeatedly exposed to a 0.01 grams per square micron stress. And for reference purposes, this stress is slightly less than half of the break stress for pristine virgin hair at 60% relative humidity. Results show that virgin Caucasian hair at 60% relative humidity requires around 37,000 cycles before breaking. Virgin African hair, by comparison, only survives around 5,500 cycles, while relaxed African hair breaks after only around 160 cycles. This startling proclivity for breakage would certainly seem to necessitate the different habits and practices that we talked about before. Yet virgin Caucasian hair, when tested at 90% relative humidity, only survives around 750 cycles before breaking, which is really rather astonishing. I think if I were to ask what's the most harmful thing you can do to your hair with regards to breakage, I think a leading answer would probably be apply a relaxer product, and this table is evidence that that answer would be a good one. But at the same time, the tendency for breakage in Caucasian hair seemingly approaches this level at elevated humidity, and this is pristine virgin Caucasian hair. Obviously hair with any degree of damage would be worse again. And again, we believe this to be an example of the mechanical properties of hair contributing to the tendency for breakage, whereby higher plasticization leads to faster flow propagation. Yet this is only a theory, and there's always the need to test theories. By this explanation, we would expect that anything that plasticizes hair would create a higher tendency for breakage, and so we start to contemplate other ways in which hair can be plasticized. Water can plasticize hair because it's a small molecule that readily penetrates into the inner structure, and there it can interfere with or solvate electrostatic bonding within the hair. And with less electrostatic bonding, the hair is going to have lesser mechanical properties. Therefore, other small molecules with hydrogen bonding capability would be expected to produce a similar, albeit perhaps lesser effect. And in the cosmetic world, perhaps the first molecule we think of is glycerol, which is of course commonly used in many products. The graph on the left shows SN curves for hair that was soaked in both 10% and 20% glycerol solutions, and does indeed show notably higher levels of breakage. If we want to think about these ideas in perhaps a more consumer-friendly or consumer-relevant manner, we can turn our attention to what we call repeated grooming experiments, where tresses are continuously brushed with a periodic counting of the number of broken fibers. And this, of course, is a type of a fatiguing experiment. We don't know what the grooming forces are, but presumably they are somewhat representative of real-life habits and practices. And in the graph on the right, you can see we observe approximately twice as many broken fibers in the glycerol-treated hair after 10,000 brushing strokes at 60% relative humidity. So we now have two sets of data from two different experiments that back up our hypothesis regarding the mechanical properties of fibers. And so in summary, and to wrap up, we propose that all factors that lead to increased breakage in hair can be conceptualized very simply just in terms of flaws. And these can be further compartmentalized into the factors that affect the presence of flaws and the factors that affect the propagation rate of those flaws. Historically, I suggest that we've only really considered or thought about the factors in this first grouping, those that dictate the presence of flaws, whether it be chemical treatments, mechanical treatments, hair type, and so forth. I don't think we've even considered the factors in the second group, those that impact the propagation rate of these flaws. Yet we've seen how there's an exponential relationship between a tendency for breakage and the magnitude of the fatiguing stress. And so there's an exponential relationship between the grooming force magnitude and the tendency to break. There's an exponential relationship to the fiber dimensions, and assuming that the fatiguing stresses are relatively small and within the range that we consider linear between the stress and the strain, then we'd also expect an exponential relationship between the degree of fiber deformation and the tendency to break. So in short, when exponential relationships are present, even small changes can quickly add up to sizable effects. and our modelling suggests the likelihood of these previously unrecognised factors very possibly providing a greater influence than the traditional flaw-creating culprits. Personally, I think the exciting thing about this idea and this theory is it gives us a framework to start contemplating how perhaps other unrecognised factors might be contributing to breakage. Take, for example, heat. Clearly, the very high temperatures used in heat straightening and curling have the potential to compromise the hair structure and create flaws. But heat will also plasticize hair, so all the tugging and the manipulation that takes place will also be taking place with the hair in a plastic and vulnerable state. And this might be sufficient to create and propagate flaws, even if the temperatures are not sufficient to cause any chemical degradation. Similarly, it's been suggested that hair has a glass transition temperature, and that even hairdryer temperatures appear sufficient to exceed this threshold when the humidity is at medium or elevated values. So here again, manipulation can be taking place in a plastic state where there is now a much higher tendency for breakage, where a higher tendency for breakage would be hypothesized. So again, there may indeed be other factors we haven't previously considered that could lead to increased tendencies for breakage, and again, this model helps us conceptualize these. So all that remains to be said is thanks for taking the time to view this video. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you'd like to talk more about this work, I would be, of course, most happy to do so. My contact information is listed at the bottom of this slide. So this is Trevor Evans once again, and thanks for listening.